The voting for a general election has opened the Solomon Islands. It's a tiny Pacific nation that has put a huge focus on the influence of China. The vote could have repercussions for the rest of the Asia-Pacific region. Now, it's said to be one of the most logistically challenging ballots. Now, here are the numbers. 420,000 registered voters heading to 1,200 polling stations spread across 900 islands in an area nearly 29,000 square kilometers. Is expected to take several weeks to collect all the ballots, followed by the elected MPs, forming a government to choose the next prime minister. Now, it is the first election since the country cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan and switched support to Beijing. Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare has pledged to further boost ties with China if re-elected. Under his leadership, China has pumped millions of dollars of investment into the Solomons. His government caught the U.S. and Australia off guard 2 years ago by signing a secret security pact with Beijing. It sparked fears of permanent Chinese military base in the South Pacific. Last year, another agreement was signed to boost cooperation with China on law enforcement and security matters as well. Now, standing in Mr. Sogavare's way are several people hoping to dislodge him. Key among them is Peter Candelaria Jr., who has vowed to abolish the China Security Pact. He's a former UN lawyer. His father, Candelaria Sr., was the Solomon Islands' first prime minister after independence. The prime minister's embrace of China partly fueled waves of anti-government riots. Violence hit the Chinatown district in the capital, Honiara, in 2019 and 2021. And there are, again, fears of unrest. And the blue fence made of steel has gone up around the Chinese embassy, and local police are also getting help to keep the peace with officers from Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea joining them on the ground.
For more, let's have a chat with Terence Wood. He's Research Fellow at the ANU Development Policy Centre, and he joins us live from Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. Terence, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. The shadow of China looming large over today's polls. Please tell us why and how a win for Sogavare could shape the South Pacific's future.
Yeah, well, good morning. I don't know just how much a win from Sogavare will have a big impact on the Pacific's future. He's certainly more pro-China than his opponents. Nevertheless, I don't think any of his political rivals would be likely to tear up existing relationships with China at present were they elected. And I'm also fairly confident that Manasseh Sogavare wouldn't do anything particularly radical, such as establishing a Chinese base, if he became Prime Minister again after this election. So everyone's interested because of China's increased presence in the Pacific and because of Solomon Islands' switch from Taiwan to China. Yet, I don't think that much is actually at stake in this election.
Okay, interesting take, Terence. I mean, politics in Solomon Islands is often fluid and unpredictable. And given only one sitting prime minister has secured re-election in the country's history, what are the chances of Mr. Sogavare getting another term?
That's a really good question. It's been one that I've been looking into in recent weeks. And of course, it's harder to answer in Solomon Islands than in most places. First, because there is no public opinion polling in Solomon Islands. But second, because the process of picking a prime minister in Solomon Islands is a two-stage process. First, because parties are very weak in Solomon Islands, voters vote for individual candidates in their electorates. And then second, those candidates move to Honiara and then engage in very secretive negotiations with respect to who they will support in a vote in Parliament for Prime Minister. And so we can be very confident that Sogavare will be one of the candidates vying to be Prime Minister. He will be re-elected within his electorate. But just how well he'll do in the negotiations is much less clear. I would say he's probably more likely than any of the other candidates to emerge from the current elections as Prime Minister. But I wouldn't make any really confident predictions about that. It's
Terence,
quite possible that he is unseated.
Understood. Terence, the politics of the Solomon Islands seem volatile, but are elections on the Solomon Islands generally free and fair? We know this is already delayed from last year.
Yeah, they are generally free and fair. It's been a real success story for Solomon Islands, which was, of course, troubled by a small-scale civil war at the turn of the millennium. Since that conflict, elections have improved with every passing election, and they're run pretty well. At least the formal process of conducting elections is run pretty well. There's very little scope for cheating in the formal electoral process. There are other things that go on in the background, though, occasional small-scale violence in parts of the country, and also a lot of vote buying, which undermine the overall electoral quality somewhat. But compared to Papua New Guinea, where I'm currently sitting, elections in Solomon Islands are really pretty well run. It's a poor, developing country. As you just explained in your introduction, elections are hard to run logistically, and Solomon Islands manages to pull all that off. And so you could say that overall elections are pretty free and fair in Solomon Islands.
But given the shocks that I've seen in the past, I mean, there's been some looming questions about whether the country's democratic processes and institutions can survive or deal with the outcomes of the election. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they will survive. I mean, you already mentioned the risk of rioting in Honiara, particularly if Manasseh Sogavare was selected again as Prime Minister. He's not popular amongst the poorer people living in the peri-urban settlements on the outskirts of Honiara, and young men from those settlements could potentially riot. That's probably the biggest risk that the country faces to its democracy and democratic processes in the wake of the elections. But even then, riots will be brought under control by the Solomon Islands police force and the international police forces who are now in Honiara too. So generally, I'm pretty confident that Solomon Islands democracy will be maintained through and after these elections. Of course, that doesn't mean that democratic governance in Solomon Islands will be particularly good. The country's political economy has never been conducive to linking democracy to a well-governed state, and so Solomon Islands will be continue to be plagued by problems such as corruption going forward. But I'm still fairly confident that 4 years from now we'll see another election occur in Solomon Islands.
Just want to bring up the point that you were just making about what the focus is going to be. I mean, the world seems to be focused on China's influence, but are voters, thinking about China, or are they more concerned about more, domestic and cost of living issues, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You might find a small subset of the country's voters, particularly the urban middle class in Honiara, and also perhaps some voters in some parts of Malaita, who may be paying more attention to international issues in this election than they would normally. However, for most voters in Solomon Islands, they're poor, they live in a poorly governed state, they have immediate material needs, so they will vote, as always, for the candidate who they think will help them, their family, or their community with direct material assistance if that candidate's elected. So in Solomon Islands, all politics, or almost all politics, electoral politics, is very localised. People are thinking about local issues within their electorate.
All right, Terence, we thank you. Appreciate your thoughts and your insight this morning. That's Terence Wood, Research Fellow at the ANU Development Policy Centre.